My son-in-law announced to his entire law firm's Christmas party that his father-in-law was just a retired postal worker from Sudbury. What he didn't know was this. For 26 years, I had been running clandestine intelligence operations for CSIS, and the deputy director was standing 12 feet away holding a glass of Pinot Noir. I'd been carrying this particular silence for 3 years. 3 years of watching my son-in-law, a corporate litigation partner at one of Bay Street's most prestigious firms, look at me the way you might look at a piece of furniture that doesn't quite match the room. He wasn't cruel in any obvious way. He was worse than that. He was dismissive. The kind of dismissal that comes from a man who has decided, fully and finally, that he already knows everything about you. His name is Philip. My daughter's name is Audrey. And my name is James Colton, though in certain federal buildings in Ottawa, I was known by 3 other names at various points in my career. The first time Philip met me, I was wearing a Roots sweatshirt and repairing a fence post at my property outside Barrie. Audrey had warned me he was coming. She hadn't warned me he'd arrive in a leased Porsche Cayenne and spend the first 10 minutes glancing at my property like he was calculating its assessed value against his expectations. "Retired?" he asked, after Audrey introduced us. "Mostly," I said. He nodded slowly, the same nod you give someone who's just told you they're mostly vegetarian. Technically acceptable, fundamentally unconvincing. I'd worked 30 years in a career I could summarize in one sentence for anyone in one hest. Federal civil service, logistics and coordination, nothing glamorous. That was the cover I'd maintained since my operational retirement. And I maintained it not out of habit, but out of genuine necessity. There were people in 3 countries who would still find the truth about my career professionally and personally inconvenient. My handler at the service had recommended I maintain what he called ambient anonymity for a minimum of 10 years post-retirement. I was in year 4. So when Philip decided I was a retired postal worker, he'd heard federal service and logistics and drawn his own conclusion, and I hadn't corrected him. I let him keep it. Over the next 18 months, I let him keep a lot of things. He kept the assumption that Audrey had married up. He kept the habit of explaining to his colleagues, at whatever function we attended together, that his father-in-law had done something in the post office, I think, before he retired to his property up north. He kept a particular tone when he addressed me at family dinners, the tone of a man who is being generous with his time, who is including you in a conversation you couldn't possibly contribute to at the level he's operating. My wife Irene would squeeze my hand under the table. She'd been squeezing my hand under tables since 1991. She knew every version of my silence. "You could say something," she said once, on the drive back from Thanksgiving at their condo in the St. Lawrence Market neighborhood. It was a beautiful condo. High ceilings, exposed brick, a kitchen that had probably never produced anything more complicated than a cheese board. "He's not ready to hear anything," I said. "He's been treating you like a charity case for a year and a half." "I know." "James." "I know, Irene." She looked out the window at the highway lights sliding past. "How long are you planning to wait?" I didn't have an answer for her then. I thought about it on the drive home. I thought about the times in my career when waiting was the entire job, weeks of surveillance, months of building operational cover, entire years of being someone else in a room where a single wrong word ended everything. Patience wasn't a virtue I'd developed. It was a skill I'd been trained in. There was a difference. The second incident was at Philip's firm's summer event, a rooftop gathering at a restaurant on King Street West with a view of the lake. Audrey had been promoted to senior associate that spring, and the party was partly in her honor. I was proud of her. She was sharp and careful and had a mother's ability to read a room in 10 seconds flat. Philip had been drinking, not drunk but loose, the kind of loose where the thoughts he usually kept internal migrated toward external. He was holding court with 2 partners and a client who I gathered was a real estate developer with significant holdings in Mississauga and the Niagara region. The client asked about family. Philip gestured vaguely in my direction. "That's Audrey's father. Retired. He's got a place up in Simcoe County. Nice enough property." "What did he do?" the client asked. "Post office, I think. Federal logistics. Nothing exciting." He laughed. The partners laughed, The client smiled politely. I was standing close enough to hear every word. I was also standing close enough to notice that a woman named Christine Beaumont-Gagnon, the Deputy Director of Operations for CSIS, was standing 4 meters to my left and had also heard every word. Christine and I had worked together for 11 years. She knew exactly who I was. She met my eyes over the rim of her glass with an expression I recognized from a dozen briefings: patient, amused, waiting. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. She smiled and turned back to her conversation. Audrey appeared beside me. She had her mother's face and my instincts, which was a combination that had served her well in litigation. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, not making a scene. "Don't be," I said. "He does it every time." "I know." "Dad, you could just." "Not yet," I said, "but soon." She looked at me for a moment. Audrey had learned to read my particular variety of quiet over 30 years. She'd stopped being fooled by it sometime around age 12. "How soon?" she asked. I smiled. "I'll let you know." The third incident was the one I couldn't walk past. Philip was preparing for a major commercial arbitration case, a dispute involving a natural resources company with assets across northern Ontario and British Columbia, a complicated case, the kind that required significant coordination with federal regulatory bodies. We were at their condo for Sunday dinner. Philip was agitated in the way he got before a big case, a kind of buzzing tension that made him sharper and less careful at the same time. He was talking about the regulatory complexity, the federal agency contacts he needed to cultivate, the intelligence, his word, that went into building a case of this scope. I was clearing plates. "You'd know something about navigating federal bureaucracy," he said to me, without looking up from his notes. His tone was that of a man making a small concession to someone who didn't deserve a larger one. "Post office, right? Lot of internal procedure." "Something like that," I said. "Must have been interesting in its way." He said it the way people say you must have tried your best to someone who finished last. Irene set her wineglass down with slightly more force than necessary. "It had its moments," I said. "The regulatory environment in federal crown corporations is actually quite—" "Philip," I said. I kept my voice even. "The natural resources company in your arbitration, Northgate Pacific?" He looked up. "How do you know the name of my case?" "It's a matter of public record through the arbitration registry, but I know Northgate Pacific for other reasons, specifically because in 2009, during an operation I was running in northern BC, we identified 3 Northgate Pacific subsidiary accounts being used to launder proceeds from an organized trafficking network operating between Vancouver and Prince George." Philip stared at me. The case was eventually handed off to the RCMP, and the resulting asset seizure changed the regulatory landscape for natural resource companies operating in that corridor for about 7 years. Some of the compliance frameworks your case will probably touch on came directly from that investigation. A silence settled over the table like snow. "What are you talking about?" Philip said. Irene looked at me with an expression that said finally, "Federal Civil Service," I said pleasantly, "logistics and coordination." I went back to clearing the plates. Philip spent the rest of the evening quiet, turning something over in his mind that he didn't have enough information to assemble into a complete picture. I could see it. The lawyer in him was uncomfortable with incomplete evidence. The arrogant man in him was uncomfortable with the possibility that he'd been wrong. He cornered me in the kitchen while Audrey and Irene were on the balcony. "James," he said, "what exactly did you do for the government?" "I told you. Federal Civil Service." "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I'm authorized to give." He stared at me. "Authorized? Some things are more complicated than they appear, Philip. Are you saying you were—" He stopped. "Intelligence?" I smiled. "I'm saying dinner was excellent and your Riesling pairing was very good." He didn't laugh. He didn't sleep well that night either, I suspected. Because the next morning Audrey called me. "What did you say to him?" she asked. She sounded somewhere between worried and delighted. "I said dinner was excellent. There, he was up until 2 in the morning on his laptop." "Looking for what?" "I don't know. But he was very quiet this morning." "Good," I said. "Quiet is a start." 2 weeks later, Philip's firm held its annual Client Recognition Gala. This was the event of the year for Bay Street litigation, the Fairmont Royal York, 300 guests, every major client in the Ontario commercial litigation ecosystem in one room. Audrey was being formally introduced as a senior associate. It was, by every measure, the most important professional night of her career so far. Philip had initially suggested, through Audrey, that perhaps I'd be more comfortable at a table near the back. Something about seating charts. Something about some of the clients being a bit particular about seniority optics at these things. Audrey had called me directly afterward, furious. Furious. He said what? Irene asked when I told her. The specific phrasing was, it might be awkward for James to be near the head table given the client profiles. Irene put down her tea. James. I know. This is enough. It is, I agreed. It really is. I called a number I hadn't dialed in 8 months. It rang twice. Jim, said the voice on the other end. It's been a while. It has, Christine. I'm calling about an event. I told her where I'd be on the 22nd. She laughed quietly, the way people laugh when they understand exactly what you're doing and have been waiting for you to do it. I'll make sure I'm there, she said. I have a client at that firm anyway. It's not even a stretch. I'd appreciate it. After what I heard on that rooftop, she said, consider it done. I also called 2 other people, a retired RCMP superintendent named Douglas who collaborated with my unit on 4 separate investigations and now sat on the board of one of Philip's most important clients, and a woman named Estelle Marchand, who had spent 15 years as legal counsel for the Privy Council office and who, it turned out, had been Audrey's articling mentor and was already on the guest list. I didn't brief any of them on what to say. I didn't need to. I just told them I'd be there, that my son-in-law had some gaps in his understanding of my career, and that if the opportunity arose naturally, they were welcome to fill them in however they saw fit. The evening of the gala, I wore a charcoal suit I'd bought in London in 2007, which still fit because fieldwork had kept me in better shape than Bay Street hours had kept Philip. Irene wore a dark green dress that she'd worn to a reception in Geneva once, at a dinner I'd attended under a different name, and I'd never told her how beautiful she'd looked in, because I was in character and couldn't afford the softness. I told her that evening, before we left the house. She looked at me. After 34 years, you're telling me now? Better late than never. She straightened my tie and said, let's go watch your son-in-law learn something. The gala was everything a Bay Street event is designed to be. Tasteful, expensive, slightly exhausting. The Royal York's main ballroom had been arranged with the particular elegance of people who charge significant hourly rates to make things appear effortless. I spotted Christine within 10 minutes of arriving. She nodded from across the room. Estelle was at the bar, already in conversation with Audrey, who looked beautiful and terrified in equal measure. Douglas arrived late and found me at the standing cocktail reception, and we talked for 20 minutes about fishing in Georgian Bay, which is what we always talked about when we were in rooms where we couldn't talk about anything else. Philip was working the room with the practiced fluency of a man who had built his professional identity around this exact environment. He was good at it. I'll give him that. He had a gift for making people feel seen for exactly 30 seconds, which is the precise amount of time required to make a strong first impression without investing in anything deeper. He saw me talking to Douglas and made his way over. Dad, he said. He'd started calling me that recently, which I found mostly ironic. Good to see you made it. Wouldn't miss it, I said. James, said Douglas, shaking my hand again with the warmth of a man who's enjoying himself. I was just telling your son-in-law we've met before. Philip looked between us. You two know each other. James and I worked together, Douglas said pleasantly. Different agencies, same files. More times than I can count, honestly. Different agencies, Philip repeated. I was RCMP. James was the one we were always glad to have in the room. He smiled. That's about as specific as I can get in a social setting. Philip's expression shifted. I recognized it from our kitchen conversation 2 weeks earlier, the incomplete evidence discomfort. What exactly? He started. Philip, I said, you should circulate. Big night. He circulated. But I could see him recalibrating as he moved through the room, looking at me differently each time our eyes met across the ballroom. The confident architecture of his assumptions was developing small structural cracks. The formal program began after dinner. The firm's managing partner gave remarks. Several clients were recognized. Then Philip stood to speak. This was his moment, his professional coronation, the culmination of the narrative he'd been building for himself since articling. He spoke well. I'll say that honestly. He was a skilled litigator, and his instincts for a room transferred to public speaking. He talked about his career, about the firm, about his vision for commercial litigation in a changing regulatory environment. He talked about his family. He looked at Audrey with genuine love. Whatever his faults, he loved my daughter. I'd never doubted that. What I doubted was whether love was sufficient without respect, and whether he was capable of the particular kind of respect that doesn't require the other person to earn it on your terms. Then he looked at me. I also want to acknowledge my father-in-law, he said, and something in his voice was different, tighter. Like a man who has started a sentence without being entirely certain how it will end. Who has taught me something recently about making assumptions. The room was politely attentive. I've been telling people for 3 years that he worked for Canada Post. A small, uncomfortable laugh from the table closest to us. And I've been wrong. I sat very still. I'm not entirely sure what he did, to be honest, Philip said, looking at me directly. But I know it was significant, and I know it was the kind of work that most people never hear about. He paused. And I know I've been an arrogant idiot. Christine, from her table, started clapping. One clean, deliberate clap. Then Estelle joined. Then Douglas. The rest of the room followed politely, uncertainly, the way people applaud when they're not sure what they're applauding, but can feel that something real has just happened. James, said Philip, would you like to say anything? I stood up. 250 people looked at me. I'd spent my career being invisible in rooms far more dangerous than this one. I worked for the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, I said. 26 years, primarily in organized crime and counter-proliferation. I retired as a senior operations director. I have a service commendation and a Governor General's award sitting in a box in my garage next to my fishing equipment. A murmur moved through the room. I didn't tell Philip because some things take time to share, and some things need to be earned. I looked at him. He was gripping the podium. I don't say this to embarrass him. I say it because the most important thing I learned in 26 years of intelligence work is that the person who tells you the least is often the person who knows the most. Philip is a good lawyer. I think he'll be a better one now. I sat down. Christine leaned over from the adjacent table and said quietly, "Nicely done." Douglas raised his glass. Audrey across the room had tears running down her face and was trying not to let the photographer catch them. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. Philip didn't collapse. He wasn't publicly humiliated in the way Marcus had been in the video I'd never seen, though the structure of the evening had rhymed with something universal enough that perhaps these stories find their own form. He was shaken. He was, for the first time in the years I'd known him, genuinely uncertain. And in that uncertainty something softer appeared. He called me the next morning. "I owe you an apology," he said. "A real one, not the speech." "The speech was a start," I said. I didn't." He stopped. Philip was not a man accustomed to sentences he couldn't finish. "I made you small because it made me feel larger. I know that. I've always known that, if I'm honest." "I know you have." A pause. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" "Because the lesson only lands when you're ready to receive it." He was quiet. "Estelle Marchand told me last night that you supervised the intelligence assessment that led to the regulatory changes her office implemented in 2011. That half the compliance law I practice today has your fingerprints on it." "Indirectly," I said. "James," he stopped again. "I'm sorry." "I know," I said. "Take care of my daughter, Philip. Not because of who I am, because of who she is." 3 weeks later, Audrey called me on a Tuesday afternoon. She'd driven up to Barry without telling me she was coming. I found her in the driveway when I came back from a walk along the creek. She sat in the passenger seat of my truck while I drove nowhere in particular. The way we used to when she was a teenager and needed to talk without the pressure of eye contact. He's been different, she said, since the gala. Different how? Quieter. More present. He asked me last week about your mother. He's never asked about your family. Ever. That's a start. She looked out the window at the fields. November in Simcoe County is a particular kind of gray that people who grew up there find comforting, and people who didn't find desolate. Audrey had grown up there. She found it comforting. Dad, I need to tell you something. Okay. I knew. For the last year, I knew more than I let on. I found the commendation certificate when I was home 3 summers ago. In the box in the garage. I didn't say anything. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I knew it meant more than Canada Post. She paused. I kept waiting for you to tell me. I was waiting for the right time. Were you also waiting for Philip to hang himself? I was quiet for a moment. I was waiting for Philip to show you who he was when he felt safe to show it, when he believed he was the most important person in the room, and there were no consequences. Audrey absorbed that. And, I said, and he did. She pulled her knees up. I'm not leaving him. I want you to know that. But I needed to see it. The real thing. Not the version he performs for clients. I know. Was that? Did you plan it to happen the way it did? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I didn't plan his speech. I didn't tell Christine or Douglas to say anything specific. I couldn't have predicted what he'd do when the pieces started coming apart. I paused, but I knew they would come apart. I spent my career learning to read the places where a structure is weak. His contempt for me was the weak place. I just had to wait for him to lean on it publicly. Audrey was quiet for a long time. I should never have let him make me embarrassed, she said finally. Of you, of this house, of any of it. You didn't know, I said, and some of it I couldn't tell you. You could have told me more than you did. You're right, I said. I could have. It was the first time in 26 years that I'd admitted that to anyone. Irene had been telling me the same thing for most of our marriage. There is a particular professional habit in intelligence work of rationing disclosure even to the people who deserve more. You stop knowing where the job ends and the withholding begins. We drove for another 20 minutes without talking. The bare fields and the grey sky and the line of dark trees along the creek. The particular piece of Simcoe County in November which I had chosen. 20 years ago, over a dozen more prestigious places I could have retired to. I had chosen it because it was quiet, and because quiet was what 26 years of noise had made me need. Are you happy? Audrey asked, eventually. I thought about the barber shop on Halsted Street. No, wrong story. I thought about my creek and my fence posts, and the Governor General's commendation in the box next to my fishing gear, and Irene's face when I'd finally told her about Geneva, and Philip's voice that morning, unguarded and uncertain, and for the first time actually asking. Yes, I said. I think I am. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Back at the house, Irene was in the kitchen making tea. She looked at Audrey and raised an eyebrow in the particular way that said, Well? Audrey sat down at the kitchen table where she'd done her homework for 14 years. Tell me about Geneva, she said. Irene looked at me. I sat down. That, I said, is going to take more than 1 cup of tea. But I told her. For the first time, I told someone who had the right to know everything, the actual shape of the life I had led. Not the cover story. Not the authorized version. The real one, with all its weight and all its cost. And all the moments I had paid for in silence. And somewhere in the telling I stopped being a retired postal worker from Sudbury. I became, simply, her father. The whole one. The real one. That turned out to be enough. More than enough. It was, in the end, the only thing that ever was. I still think about the moment Philip stood at that podium and said out loud, in front of 300 people, that he'd been wrong, not because someone forced him to, because the weight of what he'd done had finally become heavier than his pride. That doesn't happen by accident. That's cause and effect, plain and slow and patient as a winter thaw. I spent 26 years in work that required me to understand human nature at its most calculated and its most impulsive. What I learned, the thing that stayed with me long after the operational details faded, is that how a person treats someone they believe has nothing to offer them is the truest measurement of their character. Not how they treat a client, not how they perform at a gala, how they treat the man clearing the plates. Philip failed that measurement for 3 years, and I let him, not out of weakness, but because I understood that the lesson I couldn't teach him with words, life would eventually teach him with consequences. That's not cruelty. That's just how it works. The choices we make accumulate quietly, and then one evening in a ballroom they arrive all at once. What I'm proudest of isn't the commendation in the garage, or the cases that changed regulatory law, or even the look on Christine's face when she started clapping. I'm proudest that I waited, that I held my integrity intact across 3 years of being quietly diminished, without letting bitterness turn me into something smaller than what I was. That took more discipline than anything I did undercover. Operational cover requires you to perform a false version of yourself, staying genuinely peacefully yourself while someone reduces you. That requires something deeper. A kind of moral steadiness that nobody trains you for. You either have it or you build it, slowly, over a lifetime of choosing who you want to be when no one important is watching. The intelligence part, understanding the structure of the situation, reading where Philip's certainty was fragile, knowing which people to invite into the room. That wasn't strategy in any cold sense. It was simply paying attention. Most people underestimate what careful attention reveals. Philip had spent years not paying attention to me, which is why he didn't see it coming. I had spent decades learning that the person who listens most carefully is almost always the most dangerous person in the room. And then there is the part that matters most to me now. Sitting on my property in November, watching the creek and drinking bad coffee, Audrey asked me to tell her the real story. Not because she needed to vindicate me, but because she was finally ready to know her father fully. And I told her. All of it. The Geneva years, the northern BC operations, the long silences I'd owed her and hadn't paid. That conversation cost me something. The particular armor of a man who has kept himself private for 30 years doesn't come off without effort, but Audrey deserved the effort. She'd carried an incomplete picture of her father, her entire adult life, and she'd still managed to become someone I genuinely admire. That kind of resilience, choosing to love someone faithfully across all the gaps they leave, is its own form of courage. I think about Philip differently now, not with contempt, not even with the quiet satisfaction I'd expected, mostly with something like hope. He's a good lawyer. He could become a good man. Those are not the same thing, but one can grow into the other, if a person is willing to sit with the discomfort of being wrong and let it change them rather than defend against it. Whether he does that is up to him. I've done my part. The creek is freezing along its edges this week. By January it will be solid. By April it will run clear and fast again. I find that reliable.